Hey everybody, welcome to episode 86 of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Bacetta, political scientist at Lund University. Connect with the show by following us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today's episode is going to be an interview with Dr. José van Dijck, who is a distinguished professor in media and digital society at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And I'm super excited to bring you this interview because Dr. van Dijck's research has very much influenced my own by paying attention to the role of digital architectures and the way platforms are coded and designed. What does that mean for politics and society? So in this interview, we're going to talk about Dr. van Dijck's recent book, The Platform Society, Public Values in a Connected World, which is co-authored with Martin de Waal and Thomas Powell and published by Oxford University Press. And the book highlights the increasing role that platforms are shaping across different sectors in our society, everything from news to politics to housing and transportation to medicine, and essentially calls on platforms and governments to promote the role of public values in shaping the architectures and operations of these platforms. So in this interview, we're going to dive into the concepts outlined in the book, everything from platform societies to platform power. We're going to look at the role of values in the platform society and how they might differ across different regions like the EU, US, and China, and maybe what are some differences between Silicon Valley tech companies, their values, and those of the European Union. And then we'll go a bit beyond the book and talk about some recent political developments in Europe and the role of platforms there and content moderation. So overall, I think it's just a fascinating and wide-ranging interview. I think for the academics listening, this is a great one to put on your course literature list, but also one to pay close attention to. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. José van Dijck, Distinguished Professor in Media and Digital Society at Utrecht University. Dr. van Dijck, thanks so much for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
So why don't we start out by talking about the concept of platform society and why you and your co-authors decided to write a book about it? Because for me, the concept of platform society is an evolution of what Manuel Castells called the network society, which he defined as a society where the key social structures and activities are organized around electronically processed information networks. And I think the concept of platform societies better places the architectures of platforms in focus and kind of better highlights their agency and their power. So can you introduce the concept of platform societies for us and talk about what separates it from previous understandings of the network society?
Well, I'm very glad you pointed out the history of, a concept like the platform society, because there have been many concepts before, and they're actually quite interesting in, giving us insight in how the platform society works. You rightly mentioned the concept network society, which was coined by Manuel Castells in his trilogy in around the year 2000. And later, what came up was the notion of the sharing economy. And then we invented the concept of platform society. But let me start with the network society. Around 2000, Manuel Castells, he basically defined the network society as a society that is increasingly centered on social and technological networks rather than what he saw as hierarchical orders. So that was a very useful notion in the early days before the emergence of large tech companies. At that time, the internet was full of promise. Users would be king, information would be free, and the services built upon them would be free. Now, as of around, say, 2008, 2010, what we saw was a quick rise of the giant tech companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. And they very quickly developed an infrastructure of platforms, a very powerful infrastructure of platforms and applications that were fueled basically by the multiple data flows that they, of course, generated through their platforms. And this, of course, these services enabled many individuals and also smaller companies to develop platform-based services like Uber, Airbnb, Booking.com. And at that time, around 2010, 2012, we began to coin the notion of the concept of the sharing economy. It was all about offering users platforms for sharing services and goods. Now, that notion again changed around 2015 and especially 2016. And what we saw that the internet was no longer just about networks of users, and it was no longer about just the sharing economy, but it was about platforms infiltrating all infrastructures and sectors of society. So platforms, of course, they are operated by private companies, by the big tech companies I just mentioned. And platformization increasingly means privatization. Of course, users are still enabled by platforms, but increasingly users are controlled and governed by them. And that is why we coined the notion of the platform society. It's no longer just an economy, not just about sharing. It's no longer just about networks where all users are created equal. It's about an infrastructure of platforms where power is definitely an organizing principle. So that is why, we came to use this notion, and we found it to be at the center of what we tried to theorize.
Right. And it gets to this idea or this increasing power of platforms. Why don't we break that down? I was watching one of your recent presentations online, and you described this platform power or the ecology of platforms as a tree. And so I'm wondering if you could present that metaphor to the listeners and explain how these different levels of the tree contribute to platform power.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. I usually use the tree as a metaphor. It helps you to conceptualize how platform power works. And actually, it makes visible the layers of power that are actually executing power. And I divide it into three layers, basically the roots, the trunk, and the branches. Now, let me explain each of those layers to you. But the roots of the tree are basically what I call the wiring layer. It's wiring power. Castells also mentions that term, wiring power. And that, of course, is the material digital infrastructure that makes online interaction possible. Now, this layer encompasses the hardware for building microchips and wafers. It encompasses satellite systems, actual cables, in the ocean and in the ground, also the 5G infrastructure, but also the actual hardware that you and I use. So the laptops, mobile phones, any kind of services that are making those hardware devices work, like cloud servers, data computing centers. So all in all, they form the wiring layer of the internet. Parts of these hardware have become also platformized. Think, for instance, of Amazon cloud services. They're clouds and they're actually part of that hardware and software. They're operating systems, but hardware is increasingly becoming a service in the platform society. So that is the wiring layer. The trunk of the tree, the middle part, that's an intermediate layer, and it's very, very powerful. It encompasses let us call those the general purpose platforms, which connect millions, if not billions of users. And they're basically the lifelines between the roots and the branches. Now, in our book, The Platform Society, we have identified some 70 platform services that have become those, what I call intermediary bottlenecks. And they're overwhelmingly operated by the big five tech companies. So, for instance, search engines. Google is the big, powerful operator of search engines. App stores, Apple and Google are the biggest operators of app stores. Social networks, think Facebook basically, but also pay systems, Apple Pay, different pay services. Identification services, Facebook and Google are very big at that. Cloud services, Amazon is the biggest cloud service provider. Online advertising, very important. Google and Facebook sort of divide the market in online advertising. Navigation, maps, messenger services, analytics, etc. So that's the intermediate layer that sort of connects the roots to the branches. And now finally we come to the branches of the trees, and that is what I call sectoral platforms. Many new platforms actually operate in a particular branch of society. So in our book, we have investigated particularly 4 sectors, 2 private and 2 public. The private sectors are news and urban transport. Of course, they have a huge public interest. And we also investigated 2 public sectors, which is health and education. Now, interestingly, the big 5 tech companies have also nestled themselves at the center of pretty much every branch, not just those 4 that I just mentioned, but also finance, for instance. And increasingly, each of the sectors that we're seeing in society is infiltrated by these big 5 tech platforms. Now, a big advantage of those big 5 having all the layers of the trees from, especially the trunk, but also the branches and the wiring system, is that they can pursue vertical integration of data streams, of data flows. So from the roots to the trunks to the branches, they own and operate and can actually connect those data flows together. To finish the metaphor, data flows are basically the oxygen of AI. They are the oxygen of the platform ecosystem. And algorithms, we could call the water that is absorbed and that is feeding the tree from bottom to top. But the metaphor works well to show, I think, how all these different platforms and different layers are intricately connected in the back end.
Right. And they kind of photosynthesize this data with their wiring, right?
That is an interesting one. I will make it part of the metaphorical stream.
Right. I love it. I love the tree metaphor. But at the same time, trees are kind of stable constructs. They grow very slowly over time, whereas we've seen how platforms can change very rapidly from their algorithms to incorporating new features. And in the book, you write exactly about how platforms are hybrid and fluid, and they position themselves through discourse in ways that tries to sort of lessen their accountability to fit certain regulatory schemes or avoid certain regulatory schemes. But you argue that this fluidity of platforms should not mean that we lose the distinction between public and private. And I wanted to ask, why is that?
Right. That's a very important question. Although platforms, may be stable constructs, the ecosystem is definitely not. But I will come to that in just a second. Your question is very important, the distinction between the public and the private. Why is that? Well, tech companies operate a variety of platforms, and I just mentioned how, they operate platforms in all three of the layers. They can actually integrate those data flows in the back end, and whether those data come from private citizens or public agencies, they don't care. Fluidity means that, they cannot be governed according to the legal frameworks we have for, on the one hand, private companies, and on the other hand, public agencies. So, for instance, while Facebook is dominant in the news sector, Facebook, as you probably know, through Newsfeed, distributes almost 50% of all our news, still, it doesn't call itself a media company. And as, part of that trunk of the tree, it sort of moves in between what we have regulated, which is the wiring, the telecom companies, etc., and the branches, which we have sectoral regulation for. But in between, they're really sort of iffy, and they shy away, they particularly avoid legislation that is meant to control them. So they do not want to be regarded as a telecom or an internet service provider, and they do not want to act as, for instance, a sectoral company like a news organization. So each time you want to pin down a tech company within a regulatory framework, they argue they're not part of a sector. Facebook says, hey, we're not a news company. Uber says, hey, we're not a taxi company, we're a tech company. So what we're seeing is that intermediary layer can hardly be regulated, but social networks and app stores and search engines, they have become crucial gateways to our information order, almost to the extent where you can argue they have become public utilities rather than private infrastructures. So now we're here, legal scholars argue regularly that platforms like Amazon Retail or Google Search, they should be regulated as public utilities. So in fact, what we're seeing is that by becoming so flexible, so non-discriminate, so fluid, as you mentioned, we sort of lose the distinction between private and public. And that distinction is very crucial to our regulatory mechanisms.
Right. And precisely because of that, there's this inherent tension, you argue in the book, between the market, state, and civil society actors who kind of work together to shape this platform society. And you argue that this tension revolves around values. And I wanted to ask about some of looking at the geopolitical space where we have the US, China, and the EU, where the US and China have kind of their own social network companies, where the EU doesn't really have any, but is reliant mostly on Western technology. So in your view, what are the key differences between the EU and the US, which is what most of the book's empirical work comes from? And how might the fact that most platforms originate in the US, how might that lead to a clash of values with the EU?
Yeah, in fact, this is the core of the argument in the book. And of course, the platforms in the US-based and the American-based ecosystem, they tend to gloss over the distinction between market, state, and civil society. Whatever is good for Google is good for society. So market, state, and civil society actors, in fact, they have very succinct different interests. Commercial actors are at their core, of course, interested in efficiency and profit, in engaging as many users as possible to sell their devices and to sell their services, or certainly to sell their ads. Now, state actors have a very different interest. They want to protect and govern their citizens. Civil society actors, they're actually quite absent on the internet. They're absent in the platform society. They want to defend public value and civic interests, but they hardly play a role in the platform society. They're very invisible. In the American system, they're invisible. They hardly, have any power in that system. But certainly in the Chinese system, they're pretty much absent. Now, talking about the Chinese and the US system, the role of the state is very different in Europe than in the US. And you asked me about, how that plays out. Well, our understanding of the state in Europe in what we call the European Rhineland model, it's very different from the US because it puts more emphasis on public values such as privacy, as democratic control, collective well-being, but also, an emphasis on public sectors. Therefore, I think what we're trying to do is to push these values to the fore. Look at the GDPR. It took 6 years for the European Union to articulate that one value, public value of privacy and data protection in legal terms. But now, since it's been in place, it actually puts a big stamp on how the internet is governed in the EU. I think the problem is that the EU doesn't own many platforms, especially platforms with infrastructural power. They're all in the US or in China. And it's in these infrastructural layers, which I have identified to be in the wiring and in the trunk, that where values are inscribed at its core. So that is why I think the core challenge for the EU lies in transnational regulation. The GDPR has shown that. We have seen it in antitrust and competition law. The EU has given fines, big fines to Google over the past few years. And what we're seeing currently is major clashes with regulators in the EU that are all about public values. They're all about control. And that, I think, is what has been going on for the past 2 years. With all those companies being in the hands of Americans on the one hand and the Chinese companies on the other, what can the European Union do to regulate that power, which has become essential to its, governing the platform society?
Right. And I'm super curious to ask you this question, which is, as an American, as I was reading the book, your critique of the Big Five comes across as quite negative, almost as if these companies' values are fundamentally at odds with European ones because they're driven by this type of libertarian tech set of values. But I'm curious because as the book deals with Europe and we see a lot of Western European countries moving more towards the right, are these values necessarily at odds? I mean, what about right-wing Europeans who might be more sympathetic to platforms' neoliberal orientation?
Yeah, actually, I totally agree. If I had written the book over the past year, which we have not because we have written it 2 years ago, the book would have looked different, especially in this respect. There has been a fairly new political and particularly a geopolitical dynamic in Europe and, between Europe and the US since we have finished the book. So since we haven't accounted for that, it basically happened after the American elections. And we have seen a surge of a new movement in the US calling for more regulation, which is also shying away from that very, stringent neoliberal movement. Mm-hmm. They're even talking in the US about breaking up big tech companies, which I think is a remarkable move. It may even unite the right and left in the US, which is quite remarkable. So on the one hand, I dare to say this is mostly a sign of eroding trust in companies, in global companies, tech companies doing good, for society after the major scandals that we've seen with Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, with fake news, with data breaches, with security scandals. They've all led to a major breach of trust. Now, EU legislation and the fines to Google are now seen by many US citizens as a beacon of regulation, which I think it was absolutely not the case, not even 2 years ago. So definitely something has changed. Now let me come to your other question, which is about Europe and American neoliberal platforms having been a boon to nationalist, anti-EU politicians in Europe, which I think is certainly true. Just look at the growth of the right-wing and populist movements in Hungary and Poland, but also in the UK, with Brexit. I was just recently in Italy where I witnessed the surge of Lega Nord, where populist politicians have mainly relied on the use of social media to get their political message across. They rely on Facebook, on Twitter, and Instagram. So it has definitely been a major boon to right-wing politicians. So obviously, the political landscape has shifted, and it shifts continuously. On the European side, if we look the other way, if we look at a geopolitical shift that is currently being played out over the internet, it's actually being played out over internet technology. The US trade wars with China, where basically the EU is caught in the middle, it's really about the two ecosystems clashing. In the US, it's the big five that I just mentioned, the big five tech companies. In China, it's the big three, Tencent, Alibaba, and Baidu. And both are trying to build infrastructural systems where all of society is becoming dependent on what they build. And in doing so, they basically clash in the global markets, which they both try to conquer. So very recently, think of the Facebook Libra, the new Bitcoin that they're trying to start, which wants to compete with WeChat and Alipay in China. So what we're seeing is that the ecosystems on both sides of the global spectrum are trying to integrate social media networks with space systems, and then they clash at the global scale. So once again, the political landscape in which these fights, in which these global contests are now being fought over, it's incredibly interesting, and they change, they shift politically by the day. So it's incredibly interesting to examine them.
Absolutely. It's a fast moving space, both in the tech and at least in the West, the political side as well. I want to move from this sort of macro discussion to the more micro level of platforms, where you highlight three key platform mechanisms that contribute to platform power. And those are datafication, commodification, and selection. So can you outline those mechanisms for us and maybe talk about how they contribute to platform power?
Well, yeah. We have selected those mechanisms because we wanted to show how the system works, not just what it is, but how it works. Datafication basically means that every online activity or piece of information is translated into a data point and hence made computable. In any morphing context, you can sort of compute what you have done online. And that brings us to the second term, which is commodification. Every data point that you've generated can be bought, sold, or traded. So data have become currency. Data are basically like money now. So datafication is the becoming of data of all your online activities. And then finally, selection, or algorithmic selection, as we call it. The platform's proprietary algorithms, they make selections for us, like they do rankings of contents, they do rankings of ads or of users. But those algorithmic selections are often made invisible to users or citizens because we cannot see what the algorithms actually do to our data. So taken together, those three, what we call underpinning mechanisms, they form the heart of platform power. And basically they play by invisible rules by which all of our online activities are governed. The thing is that we do not see that.
Because of the sort of black box way that these algorithms are.
Right. Because of black boxes sort of hide, algorithmic black boxes, they hide what we cannot see.
Right. So if we take those black boxes, I mean, you argue that these mechanisms can essentially be reverse engineered to promote public values through a more value-centric design, which I guess would be more transparent. If we take going from, on the one end, the black box, to the other end, the more value-oriented way of having these algorithms and platforms operate, that would move towards, I think, what you call societal valorization. Can you describe that concept and maybe a few ways that platform mechanisms could be tweaked in ways that support the public good?
Right. As I said, algorithmic black boxes are often opaque. We can't look within them. Now, reverse engineering means that you can deconstruct an object to reveal its designs, its architecture, or you can extract knowledge from the object about how it works, on what values it is based. an app developer can implement certain values into the design of an app, and that is, values such as privacy, and they can actually build that into the architecture of a platform. So privacy by design basically means that the default of technology is now to protect the user's privacy. And if we look at privacy by design, we can make that in line with the GDPR. But just, privacy as a public value, I think is not enough when you do reverse engineering and try to implement that in the design of algorithms. We really need to look more into democratic control by design. How can algorithms be made explainable to citizens? For instance, just recently, my insurance company, they usually determine my premium on the basis of, data sets. But now they were telling me that they had shifted to personalized premium for housing insurance. And that premium was based on a number of variables. But when I asked them, can you reveal to me which algorithmic choices you have made? They said, no, we can't do that. That's, a business secret. So my plea for fairness and transparency is basically about explainability. Can you explain on the basis of what, hopefully public values, your algorithms make certain decisions? Now, this small argument turns into a plea for using data towards the common good. Like large citizen-generated data sets, they can be deployed toward public causes. So, for instance, think about mobility data. They're helping towards making public transport more accessible to everyone. Or think of micro measurements of air quality. A lot of citizens these days can actually measure the quality of air by just using an app on their mobile phone. And that, of course, can help monitor air quality. So platforms and algorithms should not necessarily mean the privatization of data flows. If we use data towards the common good, if we use algorithmic analytics toward a certain common good, that requires a different architecture of how we make those data flows and algorithmic selections accessible, how we make them more open. And that is, one argument that I try to put in for societal valorization.
Yeah. And I mean, the difficulty, I guess, and we saw this, I think, most pointedly in the U.S. Senate hearings in 2017, is that a lot of politicians don't understand, the very basic technologies of these platforms, much less their algorithms. And you argue in the book that local governments can play a particularly important role in regulating these platforms or increasing their orientation, I guess, towards public values. But that's quite difficult, I would imagine, because local governments don't have the resources of those national governments, which we've seen have a difficulty understanding the platform. So as you see it, what's the significance of local governments in the platform society?
Right. Well, actually, I was just as flabbergasted as you were about hearing this sort of, stupid questions that the politicians asked at those hearings. I was really put off. Of course, it's a matter of how much knowledge is there at every level of society and regulation to ask the right questions. And absolutely, local governments, I think, are paramount to the governance of platform societies. But, you hear a lot about smart cities these days, and everyone is talking about how we can use those smart cities toward bettering the public good. But rather than leaving the design of those smart cities to global tech companies, I think municipalities should really take the initiative to first articulate what public values are, in terms of privacy, of democratic control, but also in terms of citizen empowerment and fairness and inclusiveness. So cities are very good at doing that. But city governments should not let themselves be taken by surprise when they are, what currently happens all the time is they're rolled over by platforms like Uber, like Airbnb, let's take Toronto, Google Sidewalk Labs, which happened over the past 2 years. Toronto, I think, is really an example of a weak city government. They felt no need to negotiate with Google the values on, public values on behalf of its citizens. So basically, they left the entire exploitation of the city's precious resource, which is data. They left that to big tech. So when Google came in, they just gave it away. Fortunately, there are increasingly citizens all over the world, not just in Europe, but also in the US, where cities really start thinking what their responsibility is in terms of articulating those public values and then negotiating their terms with tech companies. For instance, San Francisco, you've probably heard that more recently, they put up a moratorium to developing facial recognition technology in its own backyard, by the way. I mean, it's developed right there.
Mhm.
So in many ways, I think cities do have the power to decide how their citizens are governed by big platforms and how they should act in their best interests. So although I think there's not enough knowledge right now at the municipal level to do that, it's increasing by the day. And I have very good hopes that right at the local level, we're actually taking big steps to articulate public values and implement them in technologies.
Hmm. I'd like to ask a curious question, which is about platforms acting similarly to governments in and of themselves. And I think you use the example of terms of service, where these are important instruments for platforms to govern their relationships, essentially, with users and also different business partners and clients. And so I'm wondering to what extent you view platforms as governments. In the whole kind of Facebook moderation issue, Facebook recently said it's going to create an independent body to judge what's acceptable or not. And that's been called by many commentators as Facebook's Supreme Court. So do you think platforms increasingly act as governments in and of themselves, and should they?
Interesting question. And it's intriguingly important to see how they connect to politics, of course, at every level. Um, Over the past few years, particularly, I think the big tech companies have shown the tendencies to act as big states, not just in America, but also in China. That's a different story, which I will come to. But they have the tendency to roll over state institutions, to roll over regulators, over independent institutions, and not ask for permission, but just simply take them by surprise. And in the past, we've seen regularly that they completely ignore or respect even the existing state governance. So the whole motto of move fast and break things, particularly applies to big tech companies rolling over governance institutions. But the problem is that if they do break things, and they do that sometimes very badly, as we saw in the case of fake news, for instance, they have the arrogance to call for lagging regulation. And that is what really irritates me. They refuse to critically examine their own business models as part of the problem, but then they start, once everything is broken, they start to argue for, can we please have more regulation to amend for the mistakes that we've made? So in fact, they often act as if they not only have the unique power, but also the technological know-how to fix those problems that they inflicted on societies. Not by involving states or civil society organizations, but by, often mobilizing cheap labor to clean up their mess. And let's take, the Facebook fake news disinformation problem. When Facebook was summoned by, for instance, the German regulator to clean up its social network from porn, from violent content and hate speech, which they're now obligated to do within 24 hours, they first asked nonprofit agencies to do the dirty work for them. Well, actually, they first asked news organizations, which they, of course, bluntly refused. Now Facebook has hired 30,000 very low-paid, low-skilled editors to do this for them. And, that I think is a major problem. First, breaking down the major barriers that society has put up to make things fluid, to make things good, and then breaking them down and then cleaning up the mess. On the other hand, if you look at China, which is an authoritarian state on the one hand, and in the US, the neoliberal ecosystem of platforms, you can see in both cases how closely tech companies collaborate with governments in many areas. And in many of these areas, their interests actually merge. So big platform companies increasingly behave like states, not just because they have the power and the money to do so, but because in the meantime, they have deeply infiltrated large sectors in society, including public sectors. And that is why I think we need to look so critically at, the distinct powers between public and private.
Absolutely. And just ending here, I have two questions that are short but quite open-ended. I just wanted to get your take on. And the first is, what aspects of politics do you think platforms have impacted the most?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I might argue that what they have impacted the most is political campaigns and political elections. That is something that really worries me. Take fake news, one-sided information, and propaganda tools that they're using, particularly Trump using Twitter, Salvini in Italy using Facebook, for instance. They're basically combating independent news media by exclusively addressing the audience via social media. So that is something that really worries me. What will be the future? If that has such an impact on the political system that we have built, what does that mean for the future? And of course, in the meantime, these platforms have undermined the business models of independent news organizations, not just by forcing their news distribution to Facebook and YouTube, but on top of that, they're eroding the legitimacy of independent institutions by basically bypassing the authority of not just news organizations, but also government regulation. Think of the FCC, of the media regulators in the United States. They hardly know what to do anymore with platforms having so much power. So we hear about breaking them up and how much impact they have, but there are very little mechanisms to actually keep a lid on them and to keep them in control.
Yeah, and yet they all use them, right?
Right, absolutely.
So my last question, and I personally dislike when I get this question, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on it, which are platforms. Are they ultimately positive or negative for society?
Oh, that's a good question. Are they positive or negative? Well, it depends on how the current proprietary infrastructure will evolve, I think. If the internet can be redesigned to help platforms serve public values and the common good, I think the platform society can flourish. But if this system is carried to its extremes, it will end with a loss of trust on the part of users towards both tech companies and the governments that ought to regulate them. So, it may go either way, but we really need to act upon my last prediction. The most important remedy, I think, that we need to take is to find out how platforms can strengthen, how they can reinforce current independent institutions. And what we're seeing now is the opposite. They're trying to bypass, to erode and undermine institutions. So that is, I think, one direction we need to take. We need to enhance and reinforce current societal institutions.
Absolutely. And I know it's been a lot to chew on, but I think the book is fantastic. And I want to thank you again for taking the time and coming on the podcast.
Well, you're very welcome. And thanks for asking those wonderful questions. I'm glad I could talk about it.
I've just been speaking with Dr. José van Dijck, Distinguished Professor in Media and Digital Society at Utrecht University. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be totally nerding out with Dr. Leon Drzyński from the IT University of Copenhagen about natural language processing and data science on political social media data. Until then, you can follow us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast. Visit us on the web, socialmediaandpolitics.org. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.